Imagine a church with no building, no paid pastor, no stage, no program, just ordinary people meeting in homes, everyone contributing and changing the world. Sound like a fantasy? That's exactly what the New Testament church looked like. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I want to talk about a book that for me really filled out a lot of missing context in the earliest Christian church. Frank Viola's The Untold Story of the New Testament Church. Frank Viola is a well-known author and speaker in the organic church movement. He's written many books calling Christians back to the simplicity and power of the first century church. Viola takes us back to the first century communities described in the Bible and elsewhere. He points out that the people in it were mostly illiterate, and many were from the class of laborers and artisans who had to meet before sunrise or after sunset. They met in private homes, no shrines, temples, sacrifices, or statues. They lived more as extended families than a bunch of people who met once a week. The book is basically a chronological retelling of the book of Acts, with apostles' letters interspersed at the points when they were actually written. From the arrangement of modern Bibles, you may get the impression that the pastoral letters were written after the events described in Acts. But not so. Viola fleshes out the stories with social history and the political realities that the apostles faced. In the process, he explains many of the controversies that the pastoral letters allude to. There's a wealth of detail on the fate of the apostles, the sufferings of Paul, and the personalities of the Roman world and early church, but I'll consider only a couple here. First, have you ever wondered about Paul's thorn in the flesh? He refers to this in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. It's often explained as a disability or some sort of malady.
Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me.
Paul asks God for relief, but God responds that his grace is sufficient. Although Paul mentions an illness at one point, possibly malaria, Viola's view, and that of others, is that the thorn isn't a medical condition, but a person. Specifically, the leader of the Judaizers. These were a group of people who showed up at the churches Paul had planted or taught at and told the congregants they had to be circumcised and follow Jewish dietary laws and other customs, mentioning, by the way, that they thought Paul and his assistants were out to cheat them of their money. Paul answers this charge in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 17 to 18.
Did I exploit you through any of the men I sent to you? I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not walk in the same footsteps by the same Spirit?
Paul calls this thorn a messenger from Satan, and they were truly a pain in Paul's. Well, anyway, he found them troublesome. Viola also points out that thorns were troublesome people in the Old Testament too. In Numbers 33:55.
But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those you let remain of them will be like pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land in which you dwell.
This thorn benefited us actually because he prompted Paul to write his letter to the Galatians, the oldest piece of Christian literature, and as Viola calls it, the Magna Carta of Christianity. The position and authority of women needs comment too. The reference to covering hair in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 to 16, is because married women in the Roman world at the time wore veils in public. And failure to do that brought shame on their husbands and suggested the women were promiscuous. Prostitutes and fertility priestesses also had uncovered heads.
But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved.
44 BC, there was a movement called the New Women. libertine married women who lived large and defied previous norms of chastity and fidelity. And this movement had spread by the first century. Because Paul sought to liberate women, contrary to what people say about him, some associated his ideas with support for these immoral ideas. Then there was the injunction for women to be quiet in church, in 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, often cited as evidence of sexism. Paul was apparently asked for his view of women prophesying with off-topic questions, and in 1 Corinthians shows his response. Regarding female leadership, some of the false prophets of the time were spreading a sort of Jewish proto-Gnosticism, which among other things taught that women had a form of gnosis represented by the tree of knowledge in Eden, reversing the notion of the fall and giving women authority over their husbands, for some reason. This doctrine was understandably popular among the ladies, and especially the new women, who even started lording it over the men and teaching this drill in church. Hence Paul's instructions in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12.
I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet.
Note that, as already mentioned, women were teaching, preaching, and prophesying with Paul's approval, and there were a number of influential women at the time. So it must be read in context. This wasn't a blanket ban on women speaking or sexism, it was doctrinal correction. The big idea of the book is this. The early church was radically different from what most of us experience on a Sunday morning. It was simple, participatory, and incredibly powerful, and it changed the Roman Empire with almost no resources. The early church met in homes, not dedicated buildings. The early Christians didn't have church buildings for the first couple of centuries. They gathered around tables for a full meal. The Lord's Supper was a real shared supper, not a symbolic wafer or piece of bread and a sip of wine. There were no professional clergy and no clergy-laity divide. Every believer was a priest. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:26,
When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation.
what really hits you is how simple and yet effective they were. With no buildings, no big budgets, and often under persecution, they turned the world upside down. Acts 17:6. I'm thankful for the opportunity to practice faith openly in our churches today, and I'm inspired by the early church's devotion and boldness. Viola is passionate but gracious. He's not saying everything we do today is wrong, but he invites us to ask whether we've added layers that sometimes get in the way of the simplicity and power we see in Acts. Now for some critiques and comments. I've never seen a book with so many footnotes. I was reading this in a Kindle. It makes for a rather disrupted reading experience because I kept breaking off to read them. But they are interesting because a lot of background detail is there. Second, about the church structures, I'm not sure how practical the structure would be today given the size of modern congregations and the way modern work is organized. He does mention at most points the Roman working day ended at 11 a.m. That doesn't happen anymore. The early church was small and mobile because it was under-resourced, under persecution, and relied on word of mouth with the occasional letter for communication and doctrinal correction. So if you've ever felt that church can sometimes feel routine, or if you just want to understand the New Testament church better, I highly recommend this book. It is readable, and it's full of scripture in its proper historical context. As Viola puts it,
The story of the New Testament church is a glorious paradox. It's a combination of unmatched wonder alongside a persistent train wreck. The saga is both exuberant and harrowing. It depicts the sublime with the malign.
what about you? Have you ever wondered what the very first Christians' gatherings looked like? How would you like church to be? The elegance of a high liturgy? The elegant simplicity of low church Protestants? The loud exuberance of evangelical or Pentecostal churches? Drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching. If this was helpful, Give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.